We continue our conversation of remembering September 11th, almost 20 years after that fateful day. Frank Cipolla is a former TV news anchor. He was in New York. He covered the attacks on September 11th. We have known each other from a distance for decades. And Frank, as you know, I did the same here. I'm curious, what was it like for you in New York? Because after it was over for me, I never talked about it.
Del, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm a fan of the Black News Channel. I watch BNC frequently, and I haven't talked about it publicly or on camera until this very moment, 20 years later. I know where you're coming from. The enormity was just too much to process, and I have avoided all the commemorations. I have avoided the TV shows, the documentaries. I was there. I saw all I need to see, and that was enough for me. So I could understand how people like you and I just don't want to talk about it.
Frank, it was fascinating from the Washington perspective because when I walked into our newsroom, they were watching the images coming out of New York. And you guys gave America a view into those horrific sights as the tragedy unfolded that day. How did your station even get crews out to cover the streets of what was going on? And that's what's interesting. The skies were blackened that day.
Well, if anybody has lived in New York, I grew up in Queens. I remember the buildings going up when I was in high school. I worked in both buildings when I was a radio reporter. In fact, where I got my ID to come into the building was the sub basement, and I stood there years later with the buildings gone. It was quite profound to do that. But to answer your questions, we got there any way we could. In some cases, at our station, WWOR-TV, we were located in New Jersey. We actually got people with boats to take us over. They charged us whatever it was, and we got people in boats to take us over. The city was essentially shut down at that moment. But a good reporter always wants to be near the story. I happened to be off that day. I got there as soon as I can and reported on it day in and day out for as long as I could.
Frank, we're a different generation. Nowadays, you see selfies on almost every scene. I don't have a picture. I know you said you don't have a picture except for one that came, a year, maybe years later.
Yes.
What was it about us that we just didn't do that?
Well, let's look at the enormity of it, if we can, for a moment, Dale. You're seeing something you don't usually see. First and foremost, it was one of those rare days in New York City where the humidity and the sunshine, it was just one of those beautiful September days. And September is the best month weather-wise in New York City. And then you see this, what looks like a chimney from a distance, emanating all this smoke from the first plane hitting it to the second plane hitting it. You do what a reporter does. You take all that emotion, all those feelings, you put it in a box to be processed later, and you just do your job. You're not looking to say, hey, I got to get a photograph of this. This is well before smartphone video, and camera video on the phone. So, you do what you can. I remember it was almost a year later, Dell, when I sat down and opened up that room where I had put all that emotion from seeing what I had seen and really processed it. And it was really very emotional for me to do that. But up until that point, I didn't do it publicly or privately. I never opened that door. But I was never thinking about taking a photograph. I was thinking about the lives lost. And if I may, for just a moment, the lives for those 3,000 people who died, the families, they'll never be the same. The 353 first responders who bravely ran into that building, men and women, were killed by the collapse or killed by the falling debris. But we forget that a lot of journalists who were there day in and day out, 5 of them died immediately. They were trapped on top of the building. They were technicians and engineers. But I have lost many, many dear friends years later from aggressive cancers. In fact, a friend of mine, not more than 6 months ago, his body was riddled with cancer. They said the air was clean. The former New Jersey governor and head of the EPA at the time, Christine Todd Whitman, did a test and said the air is fine. We knew it wasn't. But despite that, we went back again and again and again. And we have to remember the 4 reporters and journalists who gave their lives actually to bring that story to America that day.
Frank, before I let you go, was there one image that captured the mood of 9/11 in your mind? For me, it was that image of them bringing the lifeless body of Father Michael Judge out of the wreckage of the Twin Towers. What was it for you?
The image in my head is not really connected to 9/11, but it's funny you should mention that. A week before 9/11, there was a firefighter who had passed away, and they had his funeral in Staten Island. And as is the case, there were hundreds of firefighters there, and Father Judge as well was there that day. And I went out as a
Yeah.
good reporter to get reaction about this firefighter who had passed on. And I have often wondered how many hands I shook that day, just the week before, would be dead a week later. And I mean, that stays with me because I saw a lot of young men and women, firefighters lined up in the streets, and I was interviewing them and shaking their hands and talking with them. I've often wondered how many of them knew that they would be gone a week later.
Frank, when I'm in New York, we'll share a beer and maybe some memories. Former New York
We will.
TV anchor Frank Cipolla. Frank, as always, thanks for being with us.